Welcome to the Deep Dive, listeners. Ready for something a bit different this time? Today, we're going deep, really deep, into the philosophy behind criminal law. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on theories of criminal law to guide us and, you know, really unpack some of the heady questions like what is the purpose of criminal law? Is it even justifiable? And how do we even begin to decide what should and should not be a crime, all that good stuff.
It's going to be a fascinating journey for sure. Criminal law, you see, it's not just a list of crimes and their punishments. It's like this intricate web that connects law, morality, and political philosophy.
Right, a real deep dive indeed. So, first things first, what makes criminal law so unique? I mean, it's not just about right and wrong, right?
No, it's not. It's about this whole system of rights, duties, powers, permissions that all come into play when we're dealing with wrongdoing.
And the consequences are a lot different too, right? A criminal conviction, that's not just a legal penalty.
No, it's not. It can really have a ripple effect on a person's life, socially, economically, politically, the whole 9 yards.
A huge impact. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it points out this thing called the asymmetry of criminal law. Basically why a vigilante can't act like a police officer, even if they think what they're doing is justified.
Right. That gets to the heart of the whole power dynamic in criminal law, right? It gives specific powers to state officials that everyday citizens don't have.
It's about maintaining order, preventing chaos, but it does kind of raise those questions about individual action versus state authority.
It certainly does.
Makes me think of that whole social contract debate. We give up some freedoms for the protection and order the state provides.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's tackle a seemingly basic but actually quite deep question. What's the point of criminal law in the first place? What's it trying to achieve?
Is it as simple as, punishing bad guys?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia, it lays out three main perspectives on this: the punitive view, the curial view, and the preventive view. Each one offers a different way of thinking about the role of criminal law.
Okay, let's start with punitive. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? Punishment for crimes.
On the surface, yes. It's basically saying that the core function of criminal law is to deliver deserved punishment. Like the old saying, an eye for an eye.
So it's about retribution, right? Making people pay for what they've done.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. The punitive view also emphasizes the importance of due process, making sure the punishment is fair and just, and that we don't accidentally punish the innocent.
Makes sense. We need safeguards to protect individual rights. So how's the curial view different?
The curial view shifts the focus from punishment to accountability. It's like saying the true power of criminal law is in calling people to account for their actions in court.
So it's not just about the punishment itself, but about giving people a chance to explain themselves and have their actions examined publicly.
Exactly. Like, imagine someone who stole something because they were being threatened or killed someone in self-defense. Even if they're not ultimately punished, there's value in them having to explain their actions, having them scrutinized in public. It adds transparency and helps us understand the situation better.
Right. Brings up those big questions about free will, too.
Yeah.
Are we really responsible for our actions if they're done under pressure or coercion?
Absolutely. The curial view recognizes that sometimes, even if someone breaks the law, their actions might be understandable, given the circumstances.
Okay, so we've got punishment, accountability, and now let's throw in the preventive view. This one's got to be about stopping crime before it happens, right?
Right on the money. The preventive view sees deterring crime as the ultimate goal. It's all about stopping harm before it occurs. If criminal law worked perfectly as a deterrent, there wouldn't be any crime to punish in the first place, right?
But, I mean, isn't prevention a part of all these views to some extent?
You're right, there's some overlap. But the preventative view really puts deterrence front and center. It makes us think about what kind of laws and punishments actually work to deter crime. Do harsh punishments really work, or do they just lead to more crime?
Sounds a bit like a utilitarian approach, aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number.
It does, and it forces us to think about the balance between individual rights and the well-being of society as a whole.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also mentions something called the imperfectionist view, which sounds like it acknowledges that, well, criminal law isn't always perfect at achieving these goals.
Exactly. The imperfectionist view says, okay, prevention is great in theory, but it's rarely perfect in reality. So when prevention fails, those other functions, punishment, accountability, upholding values, they become even more important.
It's about recognizing that all these functions are interconnected and they work together, even in an imperfect system.
Right. It's complex.
Okay, so we've talked about, how we think about the different functions of criminal law, right? Punishment, accountability, prevention. But can we actually justify having criminal law at all, knowing it has this power to harm people, to restrict their freedoms?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The Stanford Encyclopedia goes into some really interesting philosophical perspectives on this, on justifying criminal law itself. One that you might find interesting as a philosopher is the Kantian view.
Oh, okay. I'm familiar with Kant's work on morals.
Hmm.
How does that apply here?
So the Kantian view, it basically says that criminal law, even with its restrictions, it's actually essential for creating a society where people are truly free. Might sound counterintuitive, but the idea is that without criminal law, we'd constantly be at the mercy of other people's, whims and transgressions.
So by setting these clear boundaries, holding people accountable, criminal law actually allows for more individual autonomy.
Precisely. It creates this framework of rights and duties that protect our independence and allow us to live with this sense of security and freedom. It's like this delicate balance between individual liberty and the need for order.
It's making me think of Kant's whole thing about the categorical imperative, acting according to rules that we could like universalize for everyone. Could we see criminal law as a way of applying that idea to society?
That's a great connection. The Kantian view, it suggests that criminal law is helping us create a society where individuals are treated as ends in themselves, not just as means to an end. It's about respecting everyone's inherent dignity and autonomy.
But doesn't criminal law, by its very nature, infringe on those liberties? Doesn't it kind of go against the idea of freedom?
That's a good point. But the Kantian view would say that those restrictions, ultimately, they're justified because they protect a greater level of freedom for everyone in the long run. It's like that social contract idea again, right? We accept some limits on our behavior in exchange for the benefits of living in a safe and ordered society.
Okay, so that's the Kantian perspective. What about like other ways of justifying criminal law? What are some other views?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia, it also talks about the communitarian view. This one emphasizes the role of criminal law in upholding the shared values and morals of a community.
So it's like breaking the law isn't just harming an individual, it's harming the community as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. When someone commits a crime, it disrupts that social order. It undermines the values that hold us together. So criminal law in this context, it's a way of like expressing that collective disapproval, reaffirming those shared values.
The Stanford Encyclopedia also touches on what it calls impersonal justifications for criminal law, those that focus on preventing harm or upholding moral standards.
Right. Those views argue that, we have this moral obligation to prevent harm to others and to create a society that reflects, certain basic moral principles. So criminal law becomes a tool for achieving those things, even if it means, limiting individual liberties in some cases. But then the question becomes, where do we draw the line? What kind of harms are serious enough to justify making something a crime? And what moral standards are so important that we're willing to use, the power of law to enforce them?
Which brings us to another big question.
Huh.
What should and should not be a crime? How do we decide that?
Yeah, that's the age-old question, right? The Stanford Encyclopedia introduces this idea of constraints on criminalization, like rules or principles that help us set limits on what we can legitimately make a crime. Probably the most famous of these is the harm principle.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from ethics class.
Mhm.
The harm principle, something about only criminalizing actions that cause harm to others, right?
You got it. But it's more complicated than that. The Stanford Encyclopedia, it actually talks about two versions of the harm principle: the harmful conduct principle and the harm prevention principle.
Okay, so what's the difference between those two?
So the harmful conduct principle says we should only criminalize actions that are like inherently harmful or create an unreasonable risk of harm. Things like assault or theft. But the harm prevention principle, it takes a broader view. It says we can criminalize actions even if they're not inherently harmful, as long as doing so is necessary to prevent some greater harm.
So like a utilitarian approach,
Yeah.
right? Criminalizing something, even if it's not directly hurting someone, might be okay if it prevents like a bigger harm in the future.
Exactly. Think of like drug use.
Hmm.
Under the harmful conduct principle, we might only make, drug dealing a crime because that's directly harming someone else. But under the harm prevention principle, we might say, well, we need to make possession itself a crime to try to deter people from using drugs and prevent things like addiction and all the harms that come with that.
But then wouldn't that kind of step on individual autonomy, people's freedom to choose what they do with their own bodies, even if those choices might be harmful?
Yeah, that's the tension, right? The harm prevention principle, it raises these questions about, paternalism,
Yeah.
the idea that the state should be able to interfere in our lives, even if it's, for our own good.
And it also raises the question of what we even consider harm in the first place. Is it just physical harm, or does it include like emotional harm, psychological harm, even social harms?
Yeah, defining harm, that's a whole other philosophical can of worms. The broader we define harm, the more power criminal law has, which could lead to too many things being criminalized and less individual freedom.
Sounds like finding that balance between preventing harm and protecting individual freedom, that's a constant struggle for any society that values both.
It definitely is. And this whole challenge gets even more complicated when we start talking about criminal responsibility. When is someone actually responsible for their actions and what things might, lessen their blame or maybe even excuse them entirely? That's where mens rea and actus reus come into play.
Ooh, okay, sounds like we're about to go even deeper into the philosophy of criminal law, unpacking these concepts and really thinking about their ethical implications. All right, so we've really explored some of these big philosophical questions about criminal law, right? Its purpose, how we can justify having it at all, where we draw the line on what should be a crime. But like, how did these ideas actually play out, in the real world? That's where criminal procedure comes in, I guess.
Yeah, criminal procedure, that's the set of rules that govern how the justice system actually operates. Investigations, trials, sentencing, all that. It's all about ensuring that the process itself is fair and respects people's rights, even when we're dealing with folks accused of breaking the law.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it really highlights the presumption of innocence, right, as like this cornerstone of criminal procedure. It's a phrase we hear all the time, but what does it actually mean, from a philosophical perspective?
Yeah, the presumption of innocence, it's not just some legal technicality. It reflects a deep commitment to fairness and individual liberty. It puts the burden of proof on the prosecution. They have to demonstrate guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And this protects individuals from being unjustly punished, just based on suspicion or accusation.
It's a huge safeguard against the potential for like abuse of state power, right?
Hmm.
It makes the state meet this really high standard of proof before they can take away someone's freedom.
For sure. And some legal scholars even argue that the presumption of innocence should have like even broader implications, influencing decisions about arrests, detention, even how people are treated after they've served their sentences.
Yeah, I mean, if we really believe in the presumption of innocence, shouldn't it like inform every single stage of the criminal justice process, not just the trial itself?
That's the argument, and it brings up questions about the long-term consequences of having a criminal conviction and the hurdles people face when they're trying to get back into society, even after someone's done their time. The stigma of a criminal record that can really stick with them, impact their opportunities, their sense of self-worth, all that.
Heavy stuff. The Stanford Encyclopedia, it even goes so far as to suggest that the presumption of innocence should influence how we write criminal laws in the first place.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical idea. It's saying we should think of the presumption of innocence not just as some procedural rule, but as like a guiding principle for shaping the very substance of the law itself. We should be careful about creating laws that make it too easy to convict someone without solid evidence.
So laws that are like too broad or too vague or that criminalize certain behaviors without requiring proof of intent, those might be problematic from this viewpoint.
Exactly. Those kinds of laws could lead to situations where people are punished for things they didn't knowingly or intentionally do, which kind of undermines the whole idea of a fair system, right?
Okay, so switching gears a bit, let's finally unpack those concepts you mentioned earlier. Mens rea and actus reus. These are crucial for understanding criminal responsibility, right?
Absolutely. So mens rea, that refers to the mental state of the person accused. Did they act intentionally, knowingly, recklessly, or just negligently? And actus reus, that's the actual act itself. Did they actually commit the crime? Usually you need both of these to establish that someone's criminally liable.
So it's not just enough to prove that someone caused harm. We also have to look at their state of mind when they did it.
Right. Mens rea, it's really getting at the heart of moral culpability. Can we really hold someone responsible if they didn't mean to cause harm, or if they were like acting under duress or being coerced?
It's like that whole free will question again, right?
Yeah.
If someone's actions weren't truly free, can we really say they're morally responsible?
Yeah, that's the question that's kept philosophers busy for centuries, and it has real implications for criminal law. Think about defenses like insanity or duress. Those defenses, they challenge that assumption that we're always in control of our actions, and they make us question the limits of moral responsibility.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also talks about something called the correspondence principle in relation to mens rea. What's that all about?
So the correspondence principle, it basically says that each part of the harmful act, the actus reus, should have a corresponding mental element, the mens rea. In other words, the punishment should fit not only the crime, but also the mental state of the person who did it.
So, for instance, if someone is charged with murder, we wouldn't just want to prove that they, caused someone's death, right? We'd also need to show that they intended to kill.
That's it. The correspondence principle, it's aiming to make sure that the punishment fits, how morally blameworthy the act was. It prevents situations where someone gets hit with a really harsh punishment for something they didn't intend to do or couldn't have foreseen.
It sounds like mens rea is all about digging into the complexities of human motivation and intention.
Yeah.
Right? It's about drawing those distinctions between intentional wrongdoing and actions that might be harmful but don't have that element of moral blame.
You got it. And actus reus, even though it seems pretty straightforward, it also has its own philosophical puzzles. For example, what about those cases of omission, where someone fails to act when they could have prevented harm?
Oh, like that classic example of the bystander who sees someone drowning but doesn't try to help.
Mm.
Are they criminally liable?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Different legal systems, they have different approaches. Some say there's a duty to rescue in certain situations, while others say, you can't force people to be heroes.
That gets into that whole debate about positive versus negative duties,
Ooh,
right?
oh, God.
Positive duties require us to actually do something,
Mhm.
while negative duties are about not doing certain things. Criminalizing those omissions, that often means imposing positive duties, which some people argue can be too intrusive, stepping on individual autonomy.
Yeah, it's this constant balancing act, right, between our obligations to others and our right to individual freedom. And the law, it doesn't always give us those clear-cut answers.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot in this deep dive. We've explored the purpose of criminal law, that whole challenge of justifying its very existence, where we set those limits on what should be a crime and all the intricate details of criminal responsibility. It's pretty clear that criminal law, it's not just a bunch of rules, right? It's a reflection of our deepest values and beliefs about justice, about morality, and the relationship between the individual and the state.
For sure. And these philosophical questions about criminal law, they're just as relevant today as they were, hundreds of years ago. They make us think about those fundamental questions about human nature, about what it means to be responsible and the limits of state power.
So hopefully this deep dive has given you, a new way of looking at criminal law, one that acknowledges its complexities and challenges those assumptions we often have. And if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that's a great resource. Just keep those philosophical wheels turning, and remember the best questions are often the ones that don't have easy answers.